Hello, everyone. Hope you're having a fantastic day. My name is Kmart, and I want to talk about some basketball. And today, we are talking about the NBA Finals and the matchup that we've got coming up in just a couple of days here between the Boston Celtics from the East and the Dallas Mavericks from the West. Both squads won their conference finals matchups pretty convincingly and are looking for their first championships in over a decade for both teams. So we're going to take a look at the matchup here, real briefly, kind of go over some comparisons, and then give um, maybe just a slight prediction on who I think will take this series. So let's get right into it. These two teams only met up twice this season, in the regular season at least. Boston won both of those games. But we'll start our direct comparison between the two teams on the defensive side of the ball, because that's where we have maybe slightly more of a difference between these two teams. In the regular season, Boston was very clearly the better team defensively. They were third in defensive rating, fifth in points allowed, second in field goal percentage allowed, and fourth in three-point percentage allowed. Meanwhile, Dallas was not even top 15 in really any of those categories. So a pretty massive dichotomy in defense here. Boston was one of the elite defensive teams during the regular season. Dallas very much not so, sort of middle of the pack at best. Once the playoffs rolled around, though, we did see that gap sort of narrow considerably. Boston remains one of the better defensive teams in the playoff bracket, but Dallas has stepped up in a pretty significant way as well. Among playoff teams so far this year, Dallas is just sixth in points allowed, fourth in field goal percentage, and ninth in three-point percentage allowed, and fifth in total field goals allowed. So obviously, you don't really make it to the finals without sort of stepping up on the defensive end. Dallas has managed to do that so far. In terms of rebounding between these two teams, though, that gap is pretty narrow as well. Right? Boston allows the fewest rebounds to their opponents in the playoffs so far. However, the Mavericks defense are fourth in terms of rebounds allowed, and in terms of total rebounds for these squads, Boston is third in total rebounds, Dallas is fourth. So during the regular season, there was a pretty massive difference between these teams on the defensive end and on the glass in the playoffs. I would still say Boston statistically has the edge, but it's by a significantly narrower margin than it was in the regular season. So they're relatively evenly sort of matched up on that front, and a similar thing can be said for the team's offenses as a whole, from maybe a wider perspective if we don't dive into the minutia here. Boston, so far in the playoffs, has averaged slightly more in terms of scoring than Dallas, somewhere in the realm of 3 to 4 more points per game than the Mavericks so far. But if you look at their sort of shooting numbers, they are still pretty damn close. Boston shooting 48% from the field in these playoffs. Dallas less than 1% behind them at 47.1%. Similar scenario with the three-point percentage. Dallas actually has the edge there technically at 37.2%. Boston shooting 36.8%. The three-point shooting, though, is where we do see a slight difference here between the squads. The percentages may be similar, but the total volume does vary slightly. Well, maybe more than slightly. Boston leads all teams in the playoffs here in terms of three-pointers per game. They tend to shoot more threes than Dallas does, right? The Mavericks shoot 33.9 per game, Boston at 39.8. So the three-point shooting has been sort of the calling card for Boston's offense throughout the entirety of this playoff run. I don't really see that changing too much in this matchup, but it should be noted that in terms of the efficiency, the two teams are pretty much even. So that leads us sort of into point number 2 on the offensive side of the ball, and that is the fact that both of these teams are pretty heavily reliant upon their star power, upon their star duos, right? For Dallas, it's Luka and Kyrie Irving. For Boston, Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown. And those duos have really been getting things done for the team so far. Luka and Kyrie are averaging just over 50 points combined in these playoffs. Tatum and Brown combining for 51 points. So a lot of the heavy lifting is coming from those two. Between those duos, obviously, there has been one of the two guys who sort of been 1A versus 1B for Dallas. That is Luka. He's averaging 28.8 points, 9.6 rebounds, 8.8 assists, shooting 43.8 from the field and 34.3% from three. Meanwhile, for the Celtics, Tatum edging out Brown a little bit on the scoring front, 26 points to go along with 10.4 rebounds, 5.9 assists, and 44.2% from the field. So both teams really look to their star players to do a lot of the heavy lifting. Here's where we come into maybe the points of concern, though. All right, we'll start on the Dallas side because Dallas relies very heavily on Luka Doncic and Kyrie Irving, but they may do so a little bit too much. There's the risk of them perhaps being over-reliant on that star duo. There have been just 6 games in these playoffs in which either Kyrie or Luka, or I think one instance where it was both of them, haven't scored 20 or more points. In those 6 games where one of Kyrie or Luka hasn't scored 20 points, they've won just 2 of those games. So if that duo is not performing well for them, they have struggled. A lot of that is because they don't always sort of have a reliable third option here, right? There's only been 4 instances in these playoffs where someone other than Luka or Kyrie has scored 20 or more points. 3 of those was PJ Washington. 1 of them was Derrick Jones Jr. The Mavs are 3-1 in those games. So obviously these are small sample sizes here, but to really, really oversimplify here, Kyrie and Luka have to perform for the Mavericks, and it certainly helps to have a +1, to have a third option available, even if they don't necessarily need to rely on them. You want a guy like PJ Washington, Daniel Gafford, what have you, to be at least capable on the offensive end, right? Because if Boston manages to slow down Kyrie and or Luka, who steps up for Dallas offensively, right? Of course, that does lead into a pretty big question there. I said if Boston, if their defense can slow down Kyrie or Luka, the question is, can their defense actually do that? And Boston has been one of the elite defensive teams in the regular season and in the playoffs, but the Mavericks just pretty soundly beat a Timberwolves squad that was in most categories either number 1 or number 2 on the defensive end. So Boston's defense is certainly intimidating, but if you're the Mavericks, you're probably looking at this from the perspective of, well, we just took out one good defensive team. Maybe we can crack a second one. And if you're looking at this from the Boston perspective, you do need to be a little bit concerned because the teams Boston played in their previous rounds did not have that same sort of dual guard threat that Dallas is going to throw at them with Luka and Kyrie Irving. In previous matchups, Boston, at least on the perimeter in terms of star guards, really has only had to deal with one guy at a time, right? In their opening series against Miami, the ball either went down to Adebayo or it was in the hands of someone like Tyler Hero in terms of the guards, but that was a singular outside threat on the court at any particular time. The Cleveland Cavaliers leaned very heavily on Donovan Mitchell at the guard position, but as that series went on, Darius Garland became less and less of a threat, right? And then, of course, you look at the last series they played against the Pacers. Initially, it was Tyrese Halliburton. Obviously, he went down and sort of missed the rest of the series. At that point, Andrew Nembhard stepped up in a massive way, but you were still only seeing one primary scoring threat from those guards at a time. in this circumstance with the Mavericks, Luka and Kyrie are going to represent significant offensive threats who will both be at the guard spot and on the floor at the same time. And I think that's going to stretch the defense of the Celtics a little bit. It is going to challenge the defensive prowess of guys like Holiday, like Derek White. Tatum and Brown are going to ask to be extremely solid on the defensive end and mobile as well, whereas in previous matchups, maybe they didn't have to be at 100% on the defensive end. They cannot afford to slip up here because, as we were outlining before, Dallas is going to ride Luka and Kyrie as long and as far as they possibly can. If the Boston defense is not capable of slowing them down, they're going to get burned repeatedly. So, with all that being said, who wins the matchup, right? In my opinion, I would still pick Boston to win this one. I know I just outlined a pretty big concern for them on the defensive end, but I think they're going to be able to deal with those issues. I would pick Boston to win. I don't think I'd pick them in any fewer than 6 games, though, right? Boston in either 6 or 7, if I had to pick. Boston's consistency has been impressive. They've played solid defense all throughout the playoffs. Their three-point shooting has rarely ever wavered, right? They dropped 1 game in each of their first 2 series because of poor shooting, but other than that, it's been a strength for the team that has really shown very few signs of fluctuation. Supposedly, they're supposed to be getting Porzingis back at some point. I don't know if it's before the start of the series or not, but him coming back will sort of bolster the Celtics, presumably on both sides of the ball, but I would say especially on the defensive end, where he could sort of help out against guys like Gafford, guys like Lively. Boston also sort of just seems to be the deeper and slightly more balanced team overall, right? I pointed that out for the Mavericks. Luka and Kyrie have been playing great, but the help from outside of that duo has not always been there. Some solid performances from PJ Washington. As I said, 1 20-point game from Derek Jones Jr., and Daniel Gafford has been in there with somewhere between like 15 to 19 points pretty consistently as well. But is that enough? Do they have the depth if Luka or Kyrie is sort of having an off shooting night? I'm not really sure about that. Meanwhile, for Boston, we've seen guys like Derek White and Drew Holiday give them other reliable options if Tatum and Brown sort of have an off night. So it's hard to sort of maybe statistically quantify, but looking at the way that they've sort of played here, it has seemed like the supporting cast for Boston has been ever so slightly more reliable than that of the Mavericks. So that would be my guess here. Boston in either 6 or 7 games, but it's a hard one to call at this point, which is kind of remarkable because I'm not sure too many people saw Dallas being in this position in the first place against a Boston team that has basically been championship or bust now for months. So it's certainly going to be an interesting matchup, but I do think in the end Boston will be able to outlast their opponents. But that's all I got. Let me know what you think. Do you believe that Boston's going to be able to close this out? Will their defense hold? Will guys like Tatum and Brown sort of show up and have their big games? Or do you believe on the Dallas side of things that Luka and Kyrie can just kind of power through, right? Overcome another sort of top defense like they did against the Timberwolves? If you are a believer in the Dallas side, do you think that a guy like, PJ Washington, Daniel Gafford, Derek Lively, or someone will be that guy who steps up consistently for them, or will it just be the star duo to try and lead them? But either way, please feel free to let me know what you think. But other than that, thank you all so much for watching, and I will talk to you later.